Lesley-Ann, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I was really touched by reading Love Freddie because it's not really like any biography that I've ever read because it's kind of filtered through quite a number of lenses. Obviously, Freddie is at the heart of it, but you've also got B's story, and then you've got a perspective given the meticulous research that you've done over the years and biographies of Freddie. Was it a difficult book to write given that?
It's not actually a biography, is it? It's
No.
it's it's essentially Freddie Mercury's autobiography, which he told in his private notebooks and then gifted to his daughter 4 months before he died. And then she has filtered that story through her own understanding to me. And as you rightly say, I've brought my perspective to that as well. So I don't think we can call it a biography at all, but it's a fresh study of Freddie Mercury's life with information that nobody had any idea was there before. So I don't know what category you would put this book into, but I hope that most people would put it in the category of a bloody good read.
It certainly is. At one point, you was talking about how long and heartrending this process had been in terms of writing it. Can you reflect on that a little?
Yes, I mean, the first email that I received from B, as I call Freddie's daughter, there's been quite a lot of criticism in among Queen extreme fans, let's say, oh, this person calling herself B. She doesn't call herself B. That's what I call her. I know her name. She doesn't want me to disclose her name for obvious reasons. She doesn't want to go public, not ever. And so you have to call the person something. So I call her B. I refer to her as B. She wrote to me on the 15th of December 2021. The very first email dropped in was 26,000 words long. Printed it out, 41 pages. Astonishing amount of words. Like a torrent of emotion and feelings and pent up frustration, I suppose, of all the years of having kept all of this to herself. And at that point, she didn't have any intention of anyone writing a book. She had recently read my latest Freddie Mercury book, which was called Love of My Life, came out that September. So about 3 months before she wrote to me. And she read that book. She congratulated me on that book and said, "You came closer to the real Freddie than anyone has previously. But there are still a lot of things you should know." And she proceeded to tell them to me. I understand that her original intention was for me to uh, create another edition of that book, the 2021 book, and to put all of this new information into there. But of course, you can't do that. That's not how publishing works. First of all, you've got to verify all that material. You can't create out of a book that already exists another book that's twice as long, which it would effectively have been. I did speak to that publisher about it, and they said, no, it's impossible. And there were a lot of stop starts from then on because I didn't understand really what I could do with this material. It took quite some time before I worked out that I could actually write a new book. And I could deliver her new information to the public. But it had to be done in a very sensitive way. And understandably, she was very nervous about this idea and didn't know if she wanted me to proceed with something like that. She left it very much to me. And there were periods of time where we did go away and sort of say, oh no, this can't be done. It's impossible. It's too much of an obstacle. There was always the issue that she didn't want to publish her own photographs, for example, from her private collections. She couldn't, for a variety of reasons, copy pages of the notebooks and publish those. There are legal reasons why not. And so what I was left with was trying to present a story which was plausible, which is true. She does exist. She is Freddie Mercury's secret daughter, for want of a better description, although she says that at no point in her life was she made to feel like a secret. There was no shame attached. Nobody expressed any misgivings about her. She was raised in a very loving home with a mother and a stepfather, and later on there were siblings and so on. She just didn't live with her biological father, who didn't go public with her existence. And the reason for that was that the mother and the stepfather put the child first. They didn't want her to be exposed to all of uh, the rock and roll lifestyle of Freddie Mercury, for want of a better description. They wanted that child to have a normal life and for their family to have a normal life away from the spotlight, which wasn't theirs, it was his. So these people's lives would have been changed and and ruined really by exposure. So it was very important to them to keep her below the parapet and for her to have a quiet life.
This is a unique book in the sense, as you were saying at the start, for certain groups of fans, particularly those that won't have read it, they will react negatively. Can you just outline what made you verify that B was Freddie's daughter?
Yeah, as I've spoken about this before, that people jump to conclusions, they say all kinds of things, and there's a certain faction of Queen and Freddie fans who are really quite aggressive and abusive. They hadn't read the book when they started to attack me and her. Having first of all said she doesn't exist, they were also attacking her, which doesn't make sense at all. I don't really know what their problem is, why they would be so invested in the idea of a daughter not existing. Why would anybody not want Freddie to have been a father and to have had that particular joy in his life? I don't understand that. They hadn't read the book, they didn't know what was in it, but they steamed in with all their abuse. Some of these people, by the way, are former Queen employees. And you have to question what kind of minds these people have that they would take it upon themselves to stir up such hatred of a person they don't know at all. I don't understand their motivation. Mary Austin, we know, gave an interview to the Times in which, I mean, people have said, oh, she's denied it. She's denied there was a daughter. Well, she didn't actually. What she said was, I would be amazed if there were a daughter, if this turned out to be true. She also said, I never saw Freddie keep a diary. Well, of course, they weren't diaries. They were notebooks. They were just standard, book standard leather, quite nice ones actually, not book standard at all, but leather bound, hand stitched notebooks, a bit smaller than A4, that he would carry around with him and he would jot away in. But they weren't formal diaries with a date on the top of each page, and it wasn't a dear diary sort of scenario at all. Could Mary Austin and anybody else, for that matter, who lived in his household, swear blind that there was never a time when Freddie wasn't in a room by himself and could have been committing his thoughts to paper? I don't think anybody could say that. Nobody is with somebody 24/7. Mary wasn't living at Garden Lodge in 1986 anyway, but he started writing his notebooks 10 years earlier, in June 1976, when he knew that the wife of his close friend was pregnant with his child. And he was in a bit of a fix. He was in turmoil because he was engaged to Mary. He was involved in a full-blown affair with a music business executive called David Mintz, who was pressurizing Freddie to leave Mary and come and live with him. And now he's got this woman pregnant. So there's this kind of maelstrom of difficulty and complication. And he put pen to paper partly to try and make sense of it all. So at the very beginning, he wasn't writing to his child, his daughter. But as the notebooks progressed, as time went on, he did find himself beginning to write his life story. He wanted to tell her absolutely everything about his previous life, his childhood, who he was, what he came from, because I suppose he guessed there would come a time when he wouldn't be around. to tell her those things himself.
His early years in Zanzibar come out particularly strikingly in this particular book, and I understand that there's so much extra details that have been provided here.
Yes, we knew very little about Freddie's early life. I think we knew the bare bones, didn't we? I went to Zanzibar, I went to India, I found family members, I found a certain amount. Freddie himself didn't talk about his early life. We knew he'd been born in Zanzibar, that he'd spent the first 8 years of his life there, and then his parents had dispatched him to an English-style boarding school in Panchgani in India. And we knew that. We knew that he was a high flyer at school. We knew he was an all-rounder. There were photographs of him collecting trophies and so on. He was good at sport. He was musical. He joined a band. That was pretty much all we knew. And the suggestion was that he discovered rock and roll and lost interest in his academic subjects and started to concentrate on making music all the time, began to fail all his exams, and he got kicked out of school. That was the received narrative. But there was much, much more to that. Freddie was devastated to be sent away to school. He couldn't understand why his parents had done that to him. He missed them terribly. He missed his little sister. He missed his home life. He was tormented and teased and treated terribly by the other boys, probably because of the way he looked. He couldn't make sense of it. You know, they hounded him, even in the bathrooms, the toilets. He could never get away. And he developed this overwhelming sense of being terrified to go to sleep, presumably because of what might be done to him when he was off his guard. And from that time onwards, he could never sleep alone. He hated to do that. And there were some very stringent rules at the school that affected him psychologically. Things like if you didn't finish your meal when you went to the dining room, you were deprived of the next one. So he developed this fear of eating, which plagued him all his life. He had a very small appetite as an adult and never really invested very much of himself in food and eating, although paradoxically, he loved to throw dinner parties. He loved to take people out for lunch and dinner and so on. He loved laying the table very properly with all the glassware and the crockery and the silverware and the napery and so on. He took great delight in doing all those things properly. But as for eating himself, he wasn't very good at it. He would eat something like a little starter of caviar with some mashed potato and a glass of champagne or a vodka and tonic. You know, he drank more than he ate really, and that came from what he went through at school. But there was also a terribly awful episode when he was about 14, during which one of the masters at the school began taking Freddie into his quarters and raping him. And Freddie was obviously horrified by this, didn't know what to do about it. He knew that everyone else at the school knew about it, the boys anyway, and so this made him torment him even more. He couldn't tell his parents. He would go home to his aunt in what was then still Bombay during the school holidays and half terms and so on. And she noticed a difference in him. He wrote about this. She noticed that there was something wrong, and she pressed him, and he wouldn't tell her. He was so deeply ashamed of what was going on. And in the end, he effectively sabotaged his education, his academic career, so that he could get away from the school. That's what happened. And he went back to Zanzibar when he was 16 with no qualifications. There was no formal education for a boy of his age to be had in Zanzibar. What was he going to do? He wasn't qualified for anything. What would he have done? Worked on a plantation or worked at the docks or something like that. It was all looking very desperate for Freddie. Even his little friends who he'd hung around with when he was a small boy, they'd grown up now. Of course, one of them had gone back to Oman. The other two were at school on the mainland, so he could only see them during the holidays. So he was lonely and bereft and without direction. And one has to wonder what would have happened to him had there not been a revolution in 1964 that caused his family to run for their lives and they wound up in England, which was a gigantic opportunity to put into the lap of Freddie. What would have happened to him otherwise? What would he have become had he stayed in Zanzibar, unqualified, with no vocation, no profession? Where would he have ended up? It's a question we'll never know the answer to, but it does make me wonder.
It is quite a remarkable story. As a teenager, he began music lessons. He, in his head, creating worlds like the Land of Rye. This book sheds a light on the roots of Bohemian Rhapsody in terms of how, as he comes over to Britain, comes out of himself and almost invents a new personality.
Yes, he does. I mean, his songwriting, his lyrics, his poetry were something that took him out of himself from a very early age and something that helped him. And it's been said before, actually, that he was the only member of Queen, the band he would end up being part of, the only member who didn't have a fallback. The others had qualifications. Brian, we know Brian May's a physicist. Roger Taylor trained as a dentist. John Deacon was an engineer. They could have all left rock and roll, left the band, and gone back to their studies and become the things they'd set out to be in the first place. Freddie had nothing else. He had absolutely nothing else. So for him, the drive was pure. It was all encompassing. He had to become a musician. He had to be successful at that because there was no other option for him at all. So he poured everything of himself into his songwriting because his original songwriting was going to be the key to the band that he was in, to their success, to their existence. And so that was his drive. That was the all important thing. He literally put his heart into it.
Then I don't know if it was about 1970-ish. He met Mary Austin, and Mary's role in this in his life and his story really shines through. But it seems quite a complex relationship. But ultimately, they had a lifelong bond together and loved each other.
They did. Yes, they met. I should think she was 19 when they met. Freddie's a bit older, and they bonded. And she wasn't his first girlfriend, by the way, but there was something that they found in each other. I think there was significant damage in both of them. Mary had come from a silent home, effectively. Both her parents were deaf and dumb. She was an only child. Her mother had died when she was young, and she was living in a bedsit by herself and working in London when she was only still a teenager. And as I say, there was damage there. Freddie also had very deep psychological damage contained within him. And they recognized something in each other. He unloaded everything about his past, his private life to Mary. She knew everything about him. And she would never leave him. She swore to be there for him and with him for the rest of his life, and that's what she was. He sometimes said, I don't really have friends. I have Mary. I don't need anybody else. The depth of their friendship was that strong. There is a suggestion, although Freddie wrote in his notebooks that Mary was well aware of the fact that he'd fathered a child. And B understands from what he wrote and from what he said to her that Mary did know about her. It's very interesting that Mary would indicate in her interview for the Sunday Times that she didn't know anything about it, which leads us to question, is that the case? Did she not know? Did she have a reason to conceal what she knew? Or did she genuinely not know because Freddie hadn't told her? And in which case, you'd have to ask, well, why didn't he tell her if he wrote that he did? But I think it could be that he meant to. He probably intended to tell her, but he didn't find the right moment. But there was a kind of 2-year rule with Freddie. When, for example, he um, was diagnosed HIV positive, he didn't tell the other members of the band for 2 years. When he embarked on his first full-blown homosexual affair, and he was still engaged to Mary, he didn't tell her about his homosexual sideline, if you like, for about 2 years. So there was this kind of 2-year rule with him. And my guess is that he meant to tell her and just didn't get round to it. And it's highly likely that she didn't know. But she probably has worked out by now who those people were.
Again, it comes across very strongly. You've got, I think, almost daily calls between Freddie and B, seeing each other relatively regularly as well. And at points that Freddie had a room in B's family home at times, and they would, when they were living in the UK, B's family, they'd be relatively close by. So a lot of direct contact between B, Freddie, and B's family.
Yes, and again, they worked this out so that the child would be put first. So the family lived in London for the first year of her life. In 1978, they moved to Europe. In 1979, crucially, Queen purchased Mountain Studios in Switzerland. And it sort of falls into place now, doesn't it? Of course, they bought a studio in 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 Europe because it would facilitate Freddie being able to visit his baby as she was at that point. And then this carried on for a few years. And the family, her family with whom she was living, when she was 8 years old, they moved back to London. They had a house in London, which they owned, which is just around the corner from Freddie's three London properties. So Stafford Terrace, Phillimore Gardens, and Garden Lodge, which he purchased in 1980. 1985, whole family moves to London, which is walking distance from all of Freddie's three properties. And so this made it very convenient for Freddie to be able to go around, spend time with his child, and nobody was any the wiser. Even members of his own household didn't know about her. One person, crucial person, knew, which was Joe Finelli, who was Freddie's primary assistant. So not Peter Freestone, as we've been led to believe all these years, but Joe Finelli was the one who orchestrated things on Freddie's behalf. There was also the stepfather, who was very instrumental in all of this. He too had a manservant who would also take part in the arrangements. And there was a nanny called Maria, an Italian nanny, who had, in fact, been the stepfather's nanny when he was a baby. So she'd been in the family a long time, very trusted employee, part of the family. And this coterie of people facilitated Freddie and B spending time together and making sure that nobody else was any the wiser. They traveled, of course, by private plane, chauffeur-driven cars. They weren't getting on scheduled flights. They weren't jumping in and out of taxis, any of that kind of thing, which are criticisms that have been leveled at me. No, they weren't doing things the way ordinary people do them. They were doing them the way very wealthy people with tons of money to throw at these things do them. And that's the difference. And that's how they were able to keep her a secret.
But the relationship between B and Freddie, it's just explained very beautifully. It very much is a father-daughter relationship.
Probably more than most father-daughter relationships, if we're honest.
Yeah.
I was fortunate. I had a very good relationship with my dad, who I only lost 5 years ago. And, to this day, every day there's something I want to ask him. And she didn't get that long with her dad. She got less than 15 years. She was only 14, not yet 15, when he died. But they packed a lot in. Given that he was away so much on tour and in the recording studio, they arranged things so that they were able to spend significant time together. And they did all the fatherly, daughterly things together. They played games, and he loved to get down on the floor with her and play little tea parties with a porcelain tea set with the teddies and the dolls and so on. They played Scrabble, they played music together. They played four-handed piano, and they did paintings with their hands, and they would go for long walks in the mountains when they were in Switzerland together and so on, and and just had really significant time. And of course, she was too young for much of that time to have understood his lifestyle, for want of a better description. But there would come a time, and the second batch of the notebooks, he did make very clear to her, you're not to read this set of the notebooks until you turn 25. Because in those he goes into all his more adult behavior. He makes no bones about being bisexual, and he'd always understood himself to be bisexual. That wasn't anything out of the ordinary to him. But because there were other people involved, and because this was not the conventional way that people live, it would seem unusual. A lot of it would seem quite unpalatable to people. We know, for example, the film Bohemian Rhapsody was a quite diluted version of Freddie's life. And there's quite a lot that is incorrect in that film. It doesn't tell the true story. It doesn't tell us anything about the fact that he was a father. And I think this book negates that film in a way because the more essential Freddie, the more important Freddie emerges as somebody much more rounded, somebody who had a fundamental relationship with his own biological child. So who he passed his genes to. She now has children. Freddie's genes still walk the earth. That's incredible to me. And I think his story is re-examined, and we get to understand a dimension of Freddie that we didn't know during his lifetime or subsequently, because that side of Freddie has been kept quiet, and other people have had their say. Other people have come forward and, in some cases, bigged up their part, suggested to us that their role in his life was much more important than it really was. And those people have been the custodians of his story. But of course, they're not telling it exactly as it was. In this book, B, Freddie's daughter, tells his story exactly as it was. And that makes this a really important account.
Yeah, what comes across to me is you've almost got the public face, Freddie Mercury, and then you've got the personal man, Freddie Bulsara, and aspects of that I certainly weren't familiar with. So, as a very private individual at times, he had a religious framework, he had a moral framework, and he imparted those morals onto B as well.
He did indeed. He's a very spiritual man. Contrary to what we've often been told, he was also a religious man. He'd grown up in a religious community for the early years of his life, at least. His Zoroastrian Parsi culture was important to him. He was initiated into the Zoroastrian faith. He taught his daughter all about this. And her mother also was a Roman Catholic. So she had the Christian side of her spiritual education as well. And both parents made sure that she had that education and that she would be able to make informed choices later in her life. But it's certainly not true to say that Freddie was a reckless, selfish, debauched character who gave no thought to his inner life, who never cared about other people, who it was in a case of it's every man for himself. That wasn't who Freddie was. There were indeed, as you've pointed out, two Freddies: Freddie Bulsara, Freddie Mercury. Freddie Mercury was the mask, the caricature, the role that he played, and the person he hid behind, so that he could protect Freddie Bulsara, and Freddie Bulsara would be able to continue and have a private life, and also to father his child. So it worked perfectly but I think where it falls down actually is that millions of people around the world believe that Freddie Mercury was the real person. But I've been asked quite a lot in interviews, is Bea as flamboyant as her father? Does she gesticulate a lot? Is she very loud and dominates a room and all those sort of questions? I said, well, no, because that's not who he was either. That was Freddie Mercury. That was the construct. That was the character he came up with to carry all the things he needed to be as a rock star. But he wasn't him. He was Freddie Bulsara, who was quiet, well-mannered, humorous, kind, generous, and spiritual, and who said that his greatest achievement in life was his daughter.
Finally, it does shed a light on Freddie's musical side because there are certain tracks where his life story does come out, and this book, for the first time, reveals some of those aspects that we didn't know before.
Yeah, it does, because he wrote about them in the notebooks. I had no idea that, for example, there is the essence of the magic flute in Bohemian Rhapsody. We've long been told that Freddie didn't know anything about opera, for example, that Peter Freestone was the one who introduced him to opera, and that this happened during the 1980s. Well, it's not true. It was his aunt Shrew in Bombay who introduced him to opera and classical music, and he was thrilled by those genres of music, and also by religious music, and brought those elements into his rudimentary songwriting right from the very beginning. And weaving all of this layer by layer into ideas in his head, and the kind of thoughts that he wanted to convey. And this multi-layeredness in his personality really comes out in the songs, doesn't it? We can now listen, having read these explanations for the songs, which B so generously gives. We can now listen to those songs with fresh ears. And there is one song in particular that it's long been thought that John Deacon wrote the song, and that we didn't really understand what it was about. It's a song called Don't Try So Hard. It turns out that Freddie wrote that song, and he wrote it for his own child.
We started talking about critics at the start, but I assume your overarching message is read it for yourself first and then judge.
It's always the message, isn't it? Don't rush in to criticize and to put something down without having the facts before you, having the knowledge at your fingertips. Don't jump to condemn. It's a human failing, isn't it? It happens a lot in life. But please, if you are of a mind to understand Freddie Mercury, Freddie Bulsara, the man behind the mask, if you would like to know him, give his daughter a chance to tell you her story. You might just find that you learn from it, and that you grow from it, and that you love Freddie even more.
That certainly comes across. It's the most human take on Freddie that I've ever read, and thank you very much for your time, Lesley-Ann.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.